Joining me this morning is Joseph David, CEO of CAVirtex, a Canadian exchange, and you're actually the largest player in the Canadian space these days, right?
Yes, we are the single largest in Canada with $20 million traded since inception. Of course, the majority of that's been in our second year when Bitcoin really started taking off. But yes, we're the only ones in Canada.
We talk a lot about the regulatory situation in the U.S., and I had a conversation with Zach from the Lamasu Bitcoin vending machine, and they're kind of in a similar situation where there are different regulations in the United States than there are in Canada. And actually, he said that it's actually much better in Canada. They're taking a lighter touch with the regulatory side. Paint us a picture of what it's like operating an exchange in Canada these days.
I'm glad you're actually getting this directly from me because it's a little bit inaccurate when people make comments like that. What really hit us and the media lately has been that article that has been circulating the web where they even imply that Canada is a safe haven for Bitcoin exchanges, and the Canadian regulatory authorities don't really view it the same way. And what's really actually happening is FINTRAC, the regulatory body in Canada that monitors money transfers of any kinds and deals with anti-money laundering regulations as well as KYC, know your customer regulations, they have ruled that Bitcoin is a barter instrument and that Bitcoin exchanges do not need to be registered as a money service business. However, the banks is what really matters here, okay? The banks do not take direction from FINTRAC, okay? That's extremely important to understand. When we're trying to operate in Canada, we have to satisfy the banking requirements. And as far as the banks are concerned and the world is concerned when it comes to Bitcoin, everyone is very new to it. They don't know what it is. It's a big, huge gray area. It's a big, long story. There's no simple explanations to give them of exactly what a Bitcoin is. So what they see right away when you look at Bitcoin and Canadian dollars being deposited and withdrawn is they just see risk, right? They just see an unknown. And because of that unknown, they say no before they say yes. Basically, we have to approach the bank in a proactive stance. We have to approach the bank and build those relationships from the beginning like we have by saying things like, we have a legal team. We're proactive with regulatory front. We actually want the Canadian government to recognize us and tax us. Please tax us. GST is a big one, for example. In Canada, we have a goods and service tax, and there's these big, long investigations that have to go on does your business need to be registered with GST? Do you need to pay taxes to the government? It's like a goods and service tax. And instead of waiting for a ruling, we're proactive. We collect it and remit it now. So it's things like that we're doing that's showing the bank that we are serious about being proactive. And we're saying no to customers, by the way, that want to deposit large amounts of cash and bypass all these mechanisms. This is where it gets tricky. Even though FINTRAC says, no problem, you don't need to follow these rules, we are following them. And we are saying no to customers and actually turning customers away that want to bypass the rules and regulations. So explaining all of this to the banks gives us that edge and lets us operate. And of course, the whole main reason we're operation right now with the banks is because we actually have that money service business license through our investor and business partner, Tape International. So they are a registered money service business. They are collecting our payments and remitting our payments to customers and satisfying all FINTRAC and AMF requirements.
Essentially, you're complying with regulations that you don't need to comply to, not to satisfy the regulators, but to satisfy the banks, because otherwise they don't want to do business with you. Is that right?
You have it exactly. That's exactly what is happening here in Canada.
See, that's really interesting, because that actually strikes me as being almost a complete, it's the same situation in the U.S. because, so I had a conversation with Jared Kenna of Trade Hill, which kind of takes it the other way. They say, okay, well, because we're so concerned with compliance and we're so concerned that the rules are going to change further out, we're turning away customers who have less than $10,000 that they want to spend on this. So you're actually taking the complete opposite approach to it. And again, their concern isn't the banks. Their concern is with the regulatory structure, where they're concerned the regulations are going to change and become harsher at a later point, and in doing so, essentially retroactively make their actions in the past not work, unless they do this proactive. Are you concerned about the regulatory system changing, or is this really just about the banks for you?
Well, again, because we're proactive, we want the regulatory system to change. We want the regulatory body to be formed in Canada. We have the ambitious goal of being part of that movement. I would like nothing better than to be on the board of directors of the new regulatory agency in Canada that governs and regulates digital currencies. We have a really interesting development on that front, if I may tell you about it. This is very, very groundbreaking stuff here in Canada, is the Canadian government has something called the Mint Chip Project. And the Mint Chip is actually a digital currency in Canada created with a crown corporation, which just means government corporation here in Canada, and run by the Canadian government, endorsed by the Royal Canadian Mint. And it is being used as a testing the waters type sample project right now. So it's not a currency you can buy right now and use in circulation in Canada. They're on the beginning stages of introducing this as a testing digital currency in Canada. So you'll be able to go to any Canadian bank, for example, and change Canadian dollars into mint chips. And to follow that even further, mint chips into bitcoins. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah.
So there's some interesting stuff going on in Canada.
When you talk about wanting to be part of the regulatory structure that you're trying to incentivize the creation of, basically, in your mind, is this an industry group that is self-regulating exchanges and self-regulating, or is this actually a government regulatory body that you would want to be a part of and so actually be part of the government in that way?
In your first scenario of some kind of self-regulating industry group, that would eventually merge into a government body. So I don't know what steps it's going to take. I foresee it starting with an industry self-regulation group and then going toward government. But I don't think you can stop the government. There's no stopping the government noticing this. As Bitcoin gets bigger in Canada, as more and more people start using it, the government is going to notice. For example, one of my ambitious plans that we're starting very shortly here in the next month is to sign up try to sign up every online Canadian merchant that accepts online payments to add a Bitcoin shopping cart checkout button to their webpage. This, I think, is the best way to educate the public, because we have to remember something here about Bitcoin. Just, we both know about it. We're both following this. But I estimate that a large majority of the population doesn't even know what a Bitcoin is. So there's a lot of people that still have no clue what's going on in the whole Bitcoin revolution. So the best way, I think, to get the word out there is to get on that shopping cart checkout site. So all these customers that are going along their daily activity of purchasing goods online see this thing called a Bitcoin checkout beside Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. And then they see the price difference, okay, $100 on Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, $95 on Bitcoin checkout. And then they ask themselves a question: why is it cheaper in Bitcoin, and what is a Bitcoin? And that's where I think we're going to be starting to spread like wildfire. That's going to ignite the government, I think, a little bit when they start seeing a majority of online Canadian business add this alternate currency to their checkout.
You mentioned the Mint chip earlier in our conversation. The Mint chip is something that popped up a couple of years ago, and I actually wasn't aware it was getting any traction. With the Mint chip, is this a cryptocurrency, or is it just a digital currency? I mean, does it have any of the advantages that Bitcoin does?
Yes, it does. I don't know too much about it, but I know enough to know that it is controlled. Like even if it is a cryptocurrency or digital currency, or however they want to do this, it is controlled. There's a server somewhere with a balance of mint chips on it. So you could change that balance very easily. Of course, you can't do that with Bitcoin. So it has similarities to Bitcoin in the sense that it can be transmitted digitally online, but I think that's where the similarities end.
Paint me a picture here. What's the winning scenario? If you're successful with your ambitious plans, what does the landscape look like in a year or 2 years?
The winning scenario is to be officially recognized by the Canadian government to have a license to operate, to require a license to have operation. Because right now we have a lot of Wild West cowboy type operations that think they can just start a Bitcoin exchange, open up corporate accounts, don't even worry about money service business licenses, and accept payments through all kinds of forms that actually make the industry and make the exchange space in Canada look bad. Ideally, I'd want an operating environment where a license is required to operate, guidelines have to be followed, government regulations are satisfied when it comes to money in and money out. Official recognition and a license would be ideal operating status.
In this winning scenario, what that gives to you is the willingness then and the trust of not only banks but of big business to participate in the system and to accept the system because this type of scenario where you have a regulatory structure and a licensing structure lends legitimacy to it in the eyes of the government. Is that right?
It does. And then it also makes our banking relationships a lot easier. Another big headline news and a very big development in Canada here has been the bank shutdown. Everyone's focusing on bank shutdowns. Banking network in Canada is very different in the States. We have 6 major banks. Then we have credit unions that are part of one major network. But we don't have these private banks and these third-party banks like the U.S. does. So in Canada, when we started, Your only choices for major banks are TD, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, Royal Bank. So I just listed to you some of the major banks. We have HSBC and ING and other ones, but those five ones are pretty much the major banks. So the thing with those banks is when we started with them, we started accepting cash deposits at those banks. And then the banks started shutting us down one by one. Every single bank I've just listed to you has shut us down for cash deposits. Okay.
Right.
And that's because, again, of their concern over AML, not over fraud, because you can't commit fraud by depositing cash and then 5 minutes later going back to the teller and saying, I didn't deposit that cash. So their concern was not the fraud aspect. It was the AML aspect and the KYC, the know your customer aspect. Now, in the U.S., look at the landscape. It's much, much different. You have a company like BitInstant that allows cash deposits across the U.S. at something like 7,000 different banks. So that's very surprising and shocking to me that kind of activity is allowed in the U.S., but not allowed in Canada. And the reason it's not allowed in Canada, again, back to my original point, is because banks think it's a big gray area. They don't have an easy answer to cash, so they shut cash down. Now, the point to my whole statement here is that you don't have to deal with us in cash. There are other ways to deal with us. Okay, the major way right now is online bill payments and direct deposit and direct withdraw to your Canadian bank account. Now that is something the bank does allow under a money service business license. So that is what we're doing now. We have multiple ways that we're going to increase that. We're going to have multiple avenues where we might even actually get back into cash. But the key message here, of course, is that you have to satisfy regulations on one hand, but at the same time, you have to educate the banks and not push it too far. You know, they're letting us do online bill payments and direct deposit, direct withdraw, but they're stopping and cutting us off on the cash.
You said AML, anti-money laundering, right?
Yeah.
The question we keep coming back to with the banks is whether or not it's ignorance, they don't understand this, and so therefore there's no incentive for them to take it, or if it's actually fear, because a lot of people feel like some of the fundamental technologies and some of the fundamental things that Bitcoin does and enables sort of obsolete banking. So, I mean,
of course,
moving forward, do you think that this is something that's going to change banking and therefore there's resistance to it from that angle, or do you think that it's simply a knowledge gap?
Let's first understand again that the banks, back to your question about fear, the banks don't know what this is. So it's not knowing plus a combination of fear. Banks are very risk adverse, right? They're extremely risk adverse, especially here in Canada, where we have the government. They're called crown corporations. Corporations run by the government of Canada. They're under specific mandates to not take on any kinds of risky business whatsoever. When you walk into a Canadian bank, there's actually a sheet they give you that says if you are this type of business, and they actually list them, don't even bother applying for a bank account. They're very risk adverse. It's going to take a long time, I think, to have the banks in Canada come around and to educate on the payment method of cash. But let's not forget here what they're doing. They're already allowing current state. And current state is, as long as the money flows through a money service business that is licensed, and as long as proper due diligence is being performed, and as long as the relationship, the personal relationship that they have with me and my legal team and my lawyers, and that is all solid and intact, they allow us to operate. Okay? So it's going to take the government of Canada, I think, to step in and say, we're going to recognize the Bitcoin and we're going to we're going to give them a license. And then I can take that license to the bank and say, oh, with this license, I want to add on cash and I want to add on this and I want to add on that. It's going to take the government and the licensing agencies to make the banks change their minds, I think. The Canadian Revenue Agency, Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, did actually rule that any capital gains on Bitcoin transactions must be reported. And that is a ruling, and we are following that internally as a company. And we are answering that to any customer that asks that question.
It seems like the ability to control and exert regulatory force over cryptocurrency is kind of difficult because of just the way it's built. Outside of these limited exchanges, because you're one of the major exchanges, you are the major exchange left in Canada, and there are a few other small ones, but you could count them on two hands. I'm trying to figure out how possible it is to regulate Bitcoin outside of the exchanges, because the exchanges are the choke points.
I think it is possible. I think it's very possible because, and this actually relates perfectly to the comment I want to make here. This is an extremely important point in any country. And that's why I'm really interested about what happened in Italy. I really should read up back on that. But from what I remember on what happened, I think it was either Italy or France, but I think it was Italy, tried to shut down Bitcoin exchanges very early in the Bitcoin world. Were you aware of this?
I was not, no.
This is just from my memory long ago, back in year one, actually in probably month 7 of really the Bitcoin climb past around the $20 area. So the Italian government tried to shut Bitcoin exchange down. They succeeded. A couple of months went by. Something got appealed. The exchange owners went to the Supreme Court and appealed the decision, and then it got overturned and Bitcoin is allowed to operate. That was a long time ago, though, so things may have changed now. But that brings me to my point. Could very simply and very easily decide that they just want to shut the exchanges down. They could simply phone up the banks and say, whoever's doing Bitcoin exchange, shut them down. It's illegal. We're going to just make it illegal. The government can do that. That is one avenue the government can go. The second, of course, is everything we've just been discussing, legalizing it, getting it regulated, recognizing it, taxing it. That's avenue 2. But if we just talk about avenue 1 for a second here, the government could just step in and pull the plug. If that does happen, Canadians would have no choice then but to go offshore, to go deal with a different country, take their money offshore somehow. What would our action plan be? That's one of the things I struggle with every day. Would we take our servers offshore as well and continue with our customer base and try to service Canadians? Well, of course we can't do that. The government makes it illegal and starts seizing physical locations. That's really how the government could step in here. And that really is a concern for me in the Bitcoin space, not just for Canada, but for the world. You have U.S. politicians and senators that are against it, that are on record publicly saying this is not good. Right? Bitcoin has an image problem. And that's another thing I want to address is Bitcoin's image problem. It always comes up how you can buy drugs and guns and sex and all this stuff with Bitcoins. Well, you can do the same thing with cash, by the way. That's what people leave out, is that just like Bitcoin has an image problem, it's got the exact same issue that cash does. That's why to a lot of people I explained that Bitcoins are like digital cash. That's a very easy explanation of what a Bitcoin is. It is like digital cash. So that's sort of my ongoing concern is the government could just step in and say, we're shutting you down. That's where it could go.
You're actually kind of in the mix with this. So what do you think the chances are, relative? I mean, obviously this is totally off the cuff. What do you think the chances are of Avenue A versus Avenue B?
Right now, today, because we're so early in Bitcoin, the revolution, as I call it, is just beginning here. We're very early in it. The chance of Avenue A of the government shutting us down, I think, is very, very low. Again, very few people even know we're out there. But as things progress here in the next year, as we get the merchant signups happening, as we start educating business owners about how Bitcoin is really a way better payment method than anything they've ever seen ever, that's when the government might start to take notice. But if you want my personal prediction, I really hesitate to give predictions, especially being CEO and everyone being able to go back in time and listening to my comments and saying he's making all these predictions. I'm always cautioned by my advisors not to make predictions. But I may make an exception and make a prediction in this case. What do you think?
I think that if you want to, that's fine. The reality is that this is such a complicated topic. I think that predictions are just guesses. So, that's how we treat them. We make predictions all the time.
They're just hunches and guesses. I'll give you mine if you want it. So I think we are going to go to Avenue B. I think the government's going to recognize that we need to be taxed, we need to be regulated, that if they try to make it illegal, that it'll just create a lot more problems than it'll solve. If one government steps down and puts the gavel down and says Bitcoins are illegal in this country, other countries may either follow suit, they may have their own rules, so then of course citizens will flock to the other country. A long story short, my hunch and my personal guess is that the governments are not going to make it illegal. They're simply going to tax it heavily and try to regulate it heavily.
I'm on record for, saying that by the end of the year, we're going to see congressional hearings on this within the United States, talking about specifically Bitcoin and then cryptocurrencies broadly as well. Do you think that there's a timeline like that for Canada, or do you think that it's just unpredictable at this point?
Nowhere near it. I wouldn't even venture to say within the year. Again, because it's so new, because they hardly know about it, I don't think it's even a topic of conversation. There might be a couple MLAs in Canada, members of Legislative Assembly, that even know that Bitcoin exists. We actually contacted some of them, and their response has been, wow, this sounds like a new, interesting thing, and then they just take weeks to get their head wrapped around it, right, and don't return our phone calls. It's so new here that I don't think it's going to happen this year.
Joseph David, CAVirtex, thank you very much.
Thank you for the interview.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.